When we talk about a person acquiring a new language and their proficiency in that language, we need to be very clear what type of language we're talking about: social language or academic language. Social language is primarily conversational and casual. This is the language that is used when playing in the schoolyard or talking with friends at the lockers. English language learners can become proficient in social language in a relatively short period of time, often within 1 to 2 years. The problem is when we mistake a student's proficiency in social language for proficiency in academic language. Academic language is much more complex than social language. It includes vocabulary, understanding and participating in academic discussions, as well as reading and writing for academic purposes. It means students are only going to encounter academic language when they're engaged in using it in the classroom. As a result, it can take 5 to 7 years for ELLs to develop their academic language, even longer if that student has limited or interrupted formal education. While it is true that a student will develop their social language more quickly than their academic language, it does not mean that we delay using academic language until after social language has been acquired. Students need to develop both their conversational and their academic language concurrently. To do this effectively, there are some things we need to understand about academic language. Jim Cummins, a researcher and a linguist, explains that language varies in terms of its level of cognitive demand. For example, a casual conversation between friends does not involve language that is cognitively demanding or very taxing for the speakers. However, listening to a classroom lecture would be much more cognitively demanding. A second consideration is how contextualized the language is. That is, what information besides the actual language itself does a person have available to make sense of the communication? For example, during a face-to-face conversation, there are a range of context clues that help to underscore what is being communicated. Body language, facial expressions, hand gestures, pointing to physical objects, all these provide additional context to help make sense of what is being said. Now, let's make that into a phone conversation instead. Suddenly, all of that additional context has been eliminated. No facial expressions, no hand gestures, nothing to help navigate what is being said. The language used during a phone conversation is context reduced, meaning that there are fewer context clues available. This increases the need to rely on the language itself to understand what is being communicated. Let's look at this diagram. Here, the vertical axis represents the range of cognitive demand required for communication. Less demanding experiences, such as casual conversations, would be at the top of the axis. More demanding experiences, such as those associated with school, would be toward the bottom. Now let's consider the horizontal axis. It represents the range of context in which the communication is embedded. Communication that is more context embedded, where more opportunities are available to make sense beyond the language itself, is on the left. This is where the face-to-face conversation would be. Communication with less context, that is context reduced, such as that telephone conversation, would be on the right side because there is less context available to make meaning. Someone engaged in communication at that level would need to rely exclusively on the language itself to understand. Like social language, academic language, with a higher cognitive demand, can also be context embedded or context reduced. That means as educators, we must do 2 things. First, we must make sure that students are consistently engaged in cognitively demanding academic language. That is the only way our students will have a chance to develop their academic language proficiency. Second, we must make that academic language more context embedded so that students have many different opportunities to grab onto the language and make sense of it. In future presentations, we will look at ways that we can support our students by doing just that. For now, here are some key takeaway points. Language acquisition involves two types of language: social language and academic language. Social language is casual and develops fairly quickly, in 1 to 2 years. Academic language is more involved and takes longer to acquire, 5 to 7 years. We need to be careful not to confuse proficiency in social language with proficiency in academic language. We also need to focus on social and academic language concurrently. Social language places less of a cognitive demand on students than academic language does. All language, social or academic, is more accessible when it is context embedded, providing additional cues to help make meaning.